map as part of the EndoCompass project. So welcome to this webinar. The subject will be artificial intelligence, research and clinical impact in endocrinology. So then if you can move the next slide, just to inform today's speaker about the EndoCompass project. This project is gathering many stakeholders to generate a vision and plan for endocrine science in the coming years, with the aim to share these with European and national research and health policymakers and funding bodies. So there are secondary objectives to this project that are listed on this slide. We aim to articulate this priority to other funding mechanisms, ensuring that our scientific explorations are well supported and sustainable. We would like also to align the endocrine community around the common vision, fostering a united approach to tackle the challenge we face and we are going to face in endocrine health. We also want to demonstrate the attractiveness of endocrine research to early career researchers, highlighting the dynamic and impactful nature of our work in the field of endocrinology, and to provide a clear vision to other stakeholders, including the industry, on areas where the healthcare need is high in the field of endocrinology and where there are significant opportunities for development. So there will be several deliverables coming from this EndoCompass project. First, roadmap paper that will be published open access in the European Journal of Endocrinology. Summaries derived from the roadmap paper in order to detail the research and have policies in the field of endocrinology that we would like to support and promote in the future. And an online communication and dissemination platform for different audiences. The overall project structure is shown on this slide. This research roadmap is jointly led by the European Society of Endocrinology and the European Society of Pediatric Endocrinology. We are, for that, collaborating with various societies. They are, on one side, policy partners, and on the other side, topic area partners that align with the 9 different working groups that have been developed to cover all the various aspects that are important for the research in endocrinology. The next slide is the agenda for today's meeting. So we are at the stage of the general introduction. My name is Jérôme Berthora, and I'm the president of the European Society of Endocrinology. I'm an adult endocrinologist based in Paris Cité University. We will hear as an introductory talk from Jula Mackiewicz, Health Data and AI Regulation and Policies in Europe. Then the talk from Lean Lau, Legal and Regulatory Aspect of Health, Medical AI from the European Perspectives. Then the talk from Gustavo Carneiro, Implementation of AI in Research and Clinical Practice, Conceptual Background, and the IMAGENDO Project Showcase. At the end of these talks, we will have a question and answer session. You're welcome to submit your question in the chat box if you have not sent already to certain question by email. So I just briefly presented the speaker before the start of the webinar. So we'll hear first Lean Lau, who's a distinguished senior lecturer in bio law at Brunel Law School and the general manager of the Center for AI, Social and Digital Innovation. She has an illustrious career going from a corporate commercial attorney specialized in technology law to academia, where she brings a wealth of knowledge from her experience in the legal domain. Lean's research is clearly at the forefront of European, international, and comparative law concerning biomedical technology, delving into the ethical and legal governance of AI systems and with a proactive horizon scanning for emerging technologies. Our leadership is in a critical European Commission health policy platform project examining AI impact on health outcome for marginalized groups has been a testament to her expertise, the report of which she presented to the EU Commission this year in April. The second speaker will be Gustavo Carneiro, who's professor of artificial intelligence and machine learning at the University of Surrey, where he leads the Institute for People-Centered AI. He clearly has a career that spanned the globe from the University of Toronto, where he got his PhD, through postdoc in Santiago and the British Columbia, and a fellowship in Munich, and later on down under somehow, where he was the director of medical machine learning at the Australian Institute of Machine Learning and professor at the University of Adelaide. Gustavo research plans several cutting-edge topics in the realm of artificial intelligence, including machine learning algorithm, unsupervised learning, computer vision, as well as advancing interpretability and accuracy in deep learning diagnostic framework. As a testament to his expertise, the IMAGENDO project has won the Australian Nuclear Science and Technology prize this year. It's called also the Eureka Prize. And we will hear about this project during its presentation. So the first introductory talk, health data and AI regulation and policy in Europe, will be given by Dr. Jula Mackiewicz, who is an expert in European funding for research and innovation, with more than 20 years of experience in international collaboration. She is a biomedical researcher by background. She's based in Brussels. She shares her time between working as research partnership managers for EU funding for Brunel University in London and as an independent EU funding advisor. So, Jula, the floor is yours for the first introductory talk.
Thank you very much, Jerome. And for introduction, also to add that I was working in the European Society of Endocrinology for several years now, and also just do some work for EndoCompass project. So I'm very happy to present in this workshop. Can I have a first slide, please? Oh, is it first? Sorry. Okay. So let's start here. So artificial intelligence and general digital health technologies give a lot of promise, but for healthcare and healthcare research, but extra caution is needed given sensitivity of this sector, because of course we are talking about literally with matters of life and death. So recently a lot of regulations are developed or in development dealing with legal, ethical, other aspects regarding digital health technologies, and particularly use of health data in healthcare and health research. So I'm going to speak about some of them, but on this picture, just to say where artificial intelligence seated with digital health application, well, it's relevant to a lot of big part of it. And now let's have a snapshot what's happening in terms of regulation. Can I have next slide, please? While we are talking about data, first, health data, because there is no artificial intelligence without data. So let's have a look what's happening, regulations about data in Europe. The first thing which happened in 2018 is General Data Protection Regulation, which is particularly dealing with collection of data related to people in European Union. There are 7 principles. I'm not going to read from slides, but I think a couple of them which are really relevant to health data is purpose, limitation, accountability. And can I have next slide, please? And then there was a bit extended GDPR concerning health particularly. That was recognized data concerning health research is very special data. And there was introduction of special safeguards for personal health data and protection of such data. And there is special category of data in health, for example, general data, biometric data, data concerning health and personal sex life, and they require particular safeguards. Next slide, please. Then into 2020, we have Data Act, which actually provide protection of data, but also was talking about mechanism for public sector bodies access use data from private sector. But also we started to talk about interoperability standards for data sharing and data processing, which is important. We will see in a minute why. Then was European Data Governance Act, which is a very recent one. You see it's applicable from September 23. And they're talking particularly, for example, for reuse of health data. So that's Data Governance Act about development of trustworthy data sharing system. And particularly in context of health data, they're saying that you can save approximately 120 billion a year in European health sector, improving personalized treatment, providing better health care, and helping cure rare or chronic diseases. So that's about facilitated data sharing. Then something which I'm sure most of you are very relevant, very familiar with, which is informed consent, which is particularly relevant for clinical trials or for healthcare treatment. And next one, please. And finally, we are approaching European Artificial Intelligence Act. I'm not going to talk much about it because I believe Pin Lee is going to talk about this as well. But just to say it is still in development because European Commission have proposed one thing. They are more interested in classification and risk. European Parliament is very interested in safe, transparent, traceable, non-discriminatory, environmentally friendly artificial intelligence. And now debate are going, there are consultation with member states, and they are hoping to reach agreement by the end of this year. But we'll see, maybe it will be next year. There was a report, Artificial Intelligence Healthcare, which was talking about particularly of this act regarding healthcare. And they say, among other things, that policy and legal framework needs further development, and access, use, and exchange of healthcare data with a view on using AI also should enable it. But basically, more work is needed. And next slide, please. Then a very interesting aspect of data is cross-border sharing. Cross-border sharing has various acts and various regulations. So basically, we are approaching the time with which a lot of health data can be shared across the borders. For example, medical imaging studies, which is very relevant to Gustavo talk. And if I can have next slide, please. So sharing data across the borders will feed in big European Commission, European initiative, European Health Data Space. They put legislative proposal, and that's the idea is that you can use share data across the borders, but most importantly, you can have secondary use of electronic health data across the European Union. So European Health Data Space, which is established framework infrastructures, which will enable this happening. And if I have my next and last slide. So just to give you some broad idea what is European health data space about, for our purposes, is particularly interested that health data can be securely used for research, the data which stayed in European health data space, and used by artificial intelligence. But that's in turn raise a lot of questions how artificial intelligence, how this data should be safeguarded and regulated. And maybe on that I will stop. Thank you. So things are in development.
Thank you very much, Yula. Yes, that's a very important aspect in development for sure. A lot of questions, and you explained that to us in a very simple and clear way. Thank you very much. So we move to the next talk from Dr. Lean Lau. So the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Professor. And thank you very much, Yulia, for providing a very useful primer for all of us. And I think you've actually stated one of the most important things when it comes to AI, which is the data aspect. And thank you very much for helping to introduce that particular aspect. I'm very happy to be here today, and I'm going to be speaking about more or less the legal or regulatory aspects when it comes to health or medical AI, viewed from the position of the upcoming European Union Artificial Intelligence Act, right? So for today, I'm hoping to go through in this particular way, just to run through some of the algorithms that are currently being used in medicine and healthcare, and basically sort of highlight what are some of the problems that we see from a legal perspective, right? And then, of course, we will move into looking closely, a bit more closely at the EU AI Act, particularly from the field of health and medical AI. And then finally, we come to the implications and how it might actually affect clinicians and physicians practicing in the field, right? So very quickly, these are basically some of the areas in which AI is currently being used, right? And the past 10 years have actually seen quite a remarkable growth of the AI acceptance in a variety of domains, and in particular also in healthcare, right? There's a lot of rich opportunity for designing intelligent products to create novel services, generate all sorts of, interesting new business models also, right? But at the same time, the use of AI can actually introduce social and ethical challenges to security, to privacy, to human rights. Now, obviously, it exists, technologies in medicine exist in many forms. You have, I think Professor Gustavo will be able to highlight a little bit more, but, from purely virtual, deep learning-based health information management systems and active guidance of physicians in treatment decisions, to cyber physical, where you have robots that are used to assist attending surgeons and targeted nanorobots for drug delivery, right? So the power of AI is such that it recognizes sophisticated patterns and hidden structures. So this enables many image-based detection and diagnostic systems in healthcare to perform as well as, or even better than clinicians in some cases, right? And when we think about it, there is the saying that AI-enabled clinical decision support systems can reduce diagnostic errors. It augments intelligence to support decision-making, and it can assist clinicians with data extraction and documentation tasks also. So if we look at it in terms of the benefits, it's highly beneficial as well, right? One very interesting questions that people ask me is, will it replace doctors? And some doctors have asked me that, and I say, well, I relate to what Professor Langlotz at Stanford says. It's basically that doctors who use AI will probably replace doctors who don't use AI, and that's is probably as close as I can come to it. And just to see about the substantial impact that it can have, I see it more on like 3 levels, right? So we're looking at the level of the health and medical professionals, and then there's health systems, and then ultimately there's patients, right? The beneficiaries of healthcare systems. So at the physician level, It's by improving diagnostic accuracy. It assists with therapeutic and surgical interventions. From the health system perspective, it enables improved workflow, reduction in errors, right? And obviously from the patient perspective is through tailoring of diagnostic and treatment modalities based on the unique phenotypic and genetic features of individual patients. I tried to do a little bit of research, but I think everyone here will probably know much more than I am, but I've picked out some literature about the use of AI in endocrinology, where they have actually proven the utility in diagnostic and management of various endocrinopathies, right? So there were some examples in the ACCORD trial, the action to control cardiovascular risk in diabetes. And then there were other studies to develop vector regression models that actually apparently outperform diabetologists in predicting blood glucose levels at 30 and 60 minutes from a given time in patients with type 1 diabetes, right? And then it's also been used in validation for diagnosis and classification of diabetic retinopathy. And yeah, so they've actually demonstrated a huge ability to incorporate, things like risk factors, the duration of diabetes, the insulin use, into risk stratification of diabetic retinopathy. So it's all sounds like extremely fascinating stuff. And also in terms of prescription medicine, precision medicine, it provides a lot of very exciting venues. And probably one of the areas that may have started here in terms of precision medicine and how AI is being used is through genome-informed prescribing, probably one of the first areas to demonstrate the power of precision medicine at scale, right? And so there were particular use cases that looked at the convergence between AI and precision medicine. As Yulia already noted, we need lots and lots of data for this, right? And AI techniques have actually shown that they were very useful for efficient and very high throughput of genome interpretation. Radiogenomics is also another area that focuses on establishing associations between cancer imaging features and gene expression to predict patients' risk of developing toxicity following radiotherapy. And the AI has also been used in discovering radiogenomic associations in breast cancer, liver cancer, and colorectal cancer. So the problem that remains when it comes to precision medicine and the convergence with AI right now is actually limited data availability and where the data actually comes from. And this is actually the most formidable challenge for AI radiogenomics. So having gone through that right now and thinking about this in a larger scale, and Yulia mentioned this is very important because we're dealing with truly life or death situations. So from the legal and ethical perspectives, obviously, I'm more concerned, obviously, with the legal aspects, and which is what my research has been centered on. These are just some of the key legal ethical issues. They do overlap in some parts, right? Now, coming to informed consent, the question is, under what circumstances do the principles of informed consent how they are being deployed in the clinical AI space, right? So questions arise. To what extent do clinicians have a responsibility to educate the patient about the complexities of AI, including the forms of machine learning used by the system, the kind of data inputs, the possibility of biases or other shortcomings in the data that's being used, right? Under what circumstances must a clinician notify the patient that the AI is being used at all, right? And the thing is that when it comes to AI, there are sometimes what is called the black box, right? Where they are non-interpretable machine learning techniques that are very difficult for clinicians to understand fully. And so this lack of knowledge might or could be very worrisome for both medical professionals. And if you tell a patient, I'm sure they'd be worried about it as well. So this lack of knowledge to what extent does a clinician need to disclose that they cannot fully interpret the diagnosis or recommendations that is made by the AI system? How much transparency is needed? Because when we talk about informed consent, the chances are without all this, is it possible then for the patient to make the best decision for themselves, right? And when we talk about transparency, how does this interface with the so-called right to explanation under the EU's GDPR? And what about cases where a patient may be reluctant to allow the use of certain categories of data, like genetic data, maybe family history, for instance? And so how can we balance the privacy of patients with the safety and effectiveness of AI? And then there's the issue of, I won't go through all, I'll just go through the first three. Algorithmic fairness and biases. I deal a lot with this issue, and I deal with it particularly from the gender perspective, right? Now, we know that machine learning systems or human-trained algorithms will only be as trustworthy or effective and fair as the data that it is being trained with. So AI also bears a risk for biases and therefore discrimination. So in some of my work with developers, I try to ask them if it is possible that AI makers be aware of this particular risk and try to minimize potential biases at every stage in the process of product development, right? So if we talk about mitigation of biases, for instance, it should mean that we consider one, which machine learning technologies they want to use to train the algorithms. Two, what data sets are being used for the programming. And three, what even down to the values and of the particular team of programmers making the algorithms, right? There are many examples out there that have already demonstrated that algorithms can exhibit biases, and this results in injustice, with regards to ethnic origins, to skin color, to gender. There's things like age or disabilities as well. And so the explanation for such biases differ. It can be very multifaceted, right? And the thing is, they can result, for example, from the data sets themselves, which could be, for instance, non-representative. It could come from how data scientists and machine learning systems choose and analyze the data, right? And in the health sector, where there's phenotype and sometimes genotype related information are involved, biased AI could lead to false diagnosis and render treatments ineffective for some subpopulations. And then therefore this jeopardizes their safety, right? For instance, and this has been largely documented, AI-based clinical decision support software that helps clinicians to find the best treatment for patients with skin cancer. But because the algorithms were primarily trained on Caucasian patients, the AI software is less likely to give an accurate or even sometimes inaccurate recommendations for subpopulations for which the training data was under-inclusive, such as African-American populations, right? It's not always easy to deal with the issue of biases, and there are some small ways that can be used to sort of mitigate it, right? One way is to increase data availability, but we know that's very difficult. And then the other way is to attempt to collect better data from minority populations and to better specify for which populations the algorithm is or is not appropriately used, right? A remaining problem is that a variety of algorithms are highly sophisticated and non-transparent. And so sometimes even companies developing software will resist the disclosure and then they'll claim trade secrets in their work. So it's very difficult to deal with the bias issue, and it may actually ultimately be left to non-governmental organizations to collect the data and to try to highlight the biases. And then the third issue that I will address here is the data protection and privacy aspects, where Yulia has already given a primer, right? And one example I can give you here is that in 2017, the UK, the Information Commissioner's Office ruled that the NHS was actually in breach of the UK Data Protection Act because it provided the data of about 1.6 million patients to Google DeepMind, right? And the data sharing happened for the clinical safety testing of a particular application called Streams that was meant to be used to help with diagnosis and detection for acute kidney injury. But the patients were not properly informed about processing of their data, right? And so even though the Streams app did not actually use AI, this particular example highlighted the potential for harm to privacy rights when we are developing technological solutions. And if patients and clinicians do not trust AI, their successful integration into clinical practice will ultimately fail as well. So these are some of the key issues when it comes to, the world of big data. It's so important in the healthcare context, especially because of GDPR. Data concerning health under Article 4 sub 15 is particularly relevant because this is personal data relating to physical or mental health of a natural person, including the provision of healthcare services, which reveal information about his or her health status. And then Article 9, sub 1 of the GDPR says that processing special categories of personal data like genetic data, biometric data, and data that's concerning health is also prohibited, although there are some exceptions in Article 9, sub 2, right? And so then there are also all these other issues, which unfortunately I'm trying to be mindful of time, so I will not go into, but safety, transparency. I'll go into liability because people are always very keen about liability, especially in the realm of clinical decision-making, a domain that has for long been exclusively been overseen by human clinicians. AI will likely play a supportive role and supplementary function because of its capacity to extensively analyze medical data sets, identify patterns, etc., right? This is just a cartoon, quite funny, I thought, so just wanted to share that. But when we talk about liability, for instance, there are two types that could arise from the use of AI in healthcare. Now, the first is clinical negligence, which is the one that we probably all know about. That comes under tort law, or in some civil law jurisdictions, there are basic codes for this about negligence where a health professional fails to provide an appropriate standard of care that results then in harm to the patient. And the second is under product liability, where, for instance, defective AI software causes harm to a particular patient. And to address these concerns, obviously, it would be legislative, it would be policy options could ensure a more balanced liability system, which is why later when we come to talking a little bit about the EU AI Act, there are also two other ancillary directives, the Product Liability Directive as well as the AI Liability Directive, which accompanies the EU AI Act to deal specifically with these types of liability questions, right? So there are ways where we're thinking about how we can design liability systems when it comes to the use of AI in medicine and healthcare. Insurance is probably one of them, indemnification. Another possibility is having a special or no-fault adjudication system which provides separate legal processes for claims arising from the use of AI in healthcare, right? And handling claims basically that are difficult to adjudicate under existing liability frameworks. And so now I'll quickly come to the EU AI Act, the regulatory efforts. This is basically kind of like a telenovela in action. There's been a lot happening. So in April 2021 is when the European Commission's initial draft of the Act came out. There were lots of back and forth with that. And the stage was basically set for a series of events that would then shape the trajectory of AI governance in Europe, right? There was a turning point in about November 2022 that was spearheaded by Czechia, and the council then advocated for stringent requirements, demanding that high-risk AI systems, especially those using general-purpose AI and foundational models, be subject to stringent requirements, right? And then so this began to set the tone for the evolving discourse on how AI oversight is being handled, right? And amidst this entire regulatory evolution, there was a proposed governance architecture that was aimed to oversee foundation models and their sorts of impact. Then in June 2023, this year, the Parliament confirmed their stance. They introduced Article 28B, which outlined responsibilities for suppliers of foundation models, irrespective of how the models are shared or disseminated. And then we come to the twist again on November 10th, just recently. Negotiations basically reached an impasse because the discord centered around the regulation of influential AI models like OpenAI's ChatGPT. And then there were diverging opinions between the larger European countries, France, Germany, and Italy, that challenged the approaches. And the dispute was that it would actually undermine comprehensive AI legislation that was crafted, right? Yeah, so basically a whole bunch of events. It's still unfolding. We are hopeful that it's going to be passed at the end of the year. We're not sure. It's a gripping saga right now, full of twists, negotiations, and tensions, right? Ultimately, even thinking about it, very political for sure. But I just wanted to, well, in addition to giving you the background and giving you how all this has been sort of a chaotic situation, Professor Dr. Johann Justus Wessel illustrated this particular process of AI regulation using 3 works of art. It's very interesting, and I thought it was quite apt. You have at first Jackson Pollock's number 32, which is a symbol for the initially rather chaotic AI regulation landscape where there were lots of gaps, there were lots of void spaces. There was completely zero consideration at all for health, for medical AI, for instance. And then you had the second one, composition number 2 with red and blue. This showed the journey towards a clear, transparent, structured, but at the same time, it was rigid and inflexible regulation, right? With colors red and blue representing symbols for relationships between China, Europe, and the US. And finally, latte blue is the illustration of the European vision of global regulation according to the AI Act, right? Now, the thing about the AI Act that we need to remember is that it is going to be a regulation, not a directive, which means it is going to be binding as a legislative act and must be applied in entirety across the EU, right? It also applies to both public and private spaces. And another very prominent characteristic of the Act is its risk-based approach. And depending on whether AI systems are classified as, high risk, minimal risk, whatever, they are treated differently, right? Coming down to things like codes of conduct, transparency requirements, prohibition, different types of conformity assessments, and then notified bodies and things like that. So I guess the question is, will Europe or will the EU be able to turn the AI Act from a Pollock into a Klein? And will it likely have the Brussels effect hitting again, where the AI Act will become world standard, resembling the latte blue? So hopefully we'll find out at the end of this year, right? But having said this, because of the nature of the Act itself and all that it's been through, earlier this year, I led the European Commission Health Policy Platform Network project on how we could navigate health inequalities in the EU when it comes to AI-driven technologies, right? So using health or medical AI or considering that. And what we've actually found is that on a societal level, AI really makes it very difficult. It really makes worse structural inequalities, health inequalities, because of existing historical, social, and cultural patterns of discrimination and systems oppression, which what we call the key populations have extensively experienced, right? So key populations could be persons with disabilities, older persons, refugees, asylums, people who are undocumented, insecure resident status, racial and ethnic minorities, persons with mental health problems, children, women, persons with rare diseases, orphan diseases, and things like that, right? So in terms of thinking about AI, it's a technical tool. It cannot solve complex and multifaceted issues of societal, cultural, and environmental origin. So it is really essential to have fair representation in data, in design, research, and the technological environment. And to reduce health inequalities, when AI comes in, it can only be developed in a community-based and radically co-creational way. And that's what our stakeholder project is all about. Now, coming finally to the implications for health and medical professionals, taking into account the EU AI Act, right? Now, initially, right, when we think about the Act, actually, the risk-based approaches corresponds with, different compliance and conformity, right? Now, the obligations are imposed primarily on providers. So providers may include developers, manufacturers, processors, deployers, and then there's those who put the systems on the market. There's also importers and distributors. And this is the one that is very vague to us, users. And for me, I question, so are medical professionals users of AI systems? Or are the patient the users of the system ultimately? Because the definition of user may not be the same as it is in the General Data Protection Regulation, the GDPR, right? And there's worry that the non-clarity of issues like this could impact, for instance, doctor-patient relationships. Like, for instance, there's just some of them. I will not go into all of them, but these are the things that could happen. And just as an example, like referring to the first question, inequality in access to high-quality healthcare. I mean, we know that the technology and the deployment of AI systems is not going to be immediate. It's not going to be universal across all member states, across all healthcare systems. And so it will be inconsistent in terms of scale, speed, prioritization, right? And when you think about the unavoidable variability in deployment, it raises the possibility that geographical bias in performance and inequalities in access to the high quality healthcare will then be created because we're also using AI system, and it cuts both ways, right? So if AI systems can raise the quality of care by providing more accurate and efficient diagnosis, right, it can also then raise the possibility that it still causes inequalities because of access. Now, in terms of the specific applications of the Act, I'm sorry, I hope that I'm going to finish very quickly within the next 5 minutes, hopefully. The EU AI Act, and I'm very concerned when it comes to the health or medical aspects part because of the way the risk-based approaches are drafted, right? For instance, let me give an example. I do a lot of work on femtech, wearable technologies for women, for female, right? So menstruation, fertility control, that type of stuff. And one question that arises with regarding femtech is that if you are using a menstruation and ovulation cycle application, that is easier to classify as a low-risk AI than it might be to classify femtech use in reproductive technologies such as pre-implantation genetic testing to screen embryos, or the evaluation of genetic mutation propensity based on personal genetic information. And then that would probably be regarded as high risk, right? And the other thing that bothers me also was initially Article 37 did not include health. Article 37 of the Act initially provided that some AI systems have to be given special consideration, right? But health or medical AI was not addressed as part of that special consideration. It's now there in a minimal way, but they mentioned it to say healthcare services and essential services, but nothing more than that. So nothing about medicine, nothing within the use of the clinical setting, etc., etc. So for me, that's still not enough. The other issue is the relationship with medical devices, right? And this is where it gets very tricky. Some AI systems are also classified as medical devices. And basically, if we look at it under the Act, all systems that are listed in Annex 3 in the Act, as well as some systems that has legislation in Annex 2 that requires third-party conformity assessments, will be regarded as high-risk AI systems. And one of the regulations that fall within the criteria of Annex 2 that would require third-party conformity assessment is the medical devices regulation and the in vitro diagnostic medical devices regulation. So there's concern that the scope of the Act does not particularly value the implications that's ensuing from use of health or medical AI, and it's not clear which AI systems would qualify as medical devices, because the MDRs define medical devices very broadly. So if there is software in anything that clinicians are using, then it will become a medical device. If it becomes a medical device, then it means that not only would you have to comply with the medical devices regulation, you would also need to comply with the EU AI Act. And then so it creates an additional layer of burden for clinicians, for those working within the field, right? So these were some of my particular concerns. The Council of Europe themselves have also come up with a working framework convention on AI, human rights, democracy, and rule of law. And, you know, it's very much more human rights based. There is much more claims given for health or medical AI because it deals very much better with things like the non-discrimination. It implicates health together with things like education, employment, finance, blah, blah, blah. So it's really good to have that. And then, of course, there's principles of equality, non-discrimination, privacy, personal data protection, transparency, oversight, blah, blah, blah. So we're generally quite happy in terms of, well, I would say I'm generally more optimistic when looking at this particular framework. And so these are some of the possible legal sort of scenarios that I see when it comes to endocrinology and about certain types of devices that are being used currently and how the EU AI Act might affect it. And the first is the with active implantable medical devices like insulin infusion or delivery pumps for treatment of diabetes, for instance. So while I think this kind of devices, for example, Medtronic 670G insulin pump, right? It's very helpful because it helps limit liability, for instance, of the manufacturer and even the clinician to a certain extent. It imposes a higher burden on patients because they're the ones who need to interact with the pump repeatedly through day and night and things like that. And then when it comes to extending precision medicine to adrenal disorders, diabetes, blah, 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 things like that, it comes down to the question of the framework for organizing, compiling, and elucidating the influx of data that keeps in pace with scientific innovations, right, for precision medicine. And the handling of multi-parametric data and proficiency in interpreting different types of the omics data and complexity, the volume of new information, it's going to be really, really huge in terms of endocrinology as well, although there are some examples that already show, for instance, in diabetes and thyrotoxicosis, that shows that it could possibly start helping. And then, of course, there is reproductive endocrinology. And in the summer, I had the opportunity to basically evaluate. I can't give, this is just an example of one, a company called Fertility that has an app called, a device called Chloe. Actually, sorry, it's not QQ, it's OQ, right? It basically evaluates the oxide quality for IVF professionals to support decision-making as patients undergo fertility preservation or assisted reproductive journeys. So I had the opportunity in the summer to advise some tech companies, and one of these tech companies was in fact a similar fertility company that was developing AI-driven solutions to assess embryo viability, to assess the quality of oxides and things like that, and to sort of, yeah. But basically, what all these three have in common is that if you look at the EU AI Act, the common unifying factor between them is that they will be regarded as high-risk AI systems, which means ultimately compliance not just with medical devices regulation, but also the EU AI Act, where there is a whole bunch of conformity assessments that's been laid out in Article 43. And so essentially those are my key areas. Of course, there are future policy focus on what we can do for health and medical AI. and some imperatives that I feel are important, especially when we're talking about the human rights perspective. Thank you very much for your time. I'm really sorry if I've over exceeded my presentation time, but thank you so much.
Well, thank you very much, Lean Lau. We understood that this is a very complex problem. So, but for the sake of time, we'll move indeed to save time for the discussion at the end to the talk from Gustavo Carneiro. So the floor is yours now.
Okay. All right. So thanks for the invitation and the generous introduction about me. Okay. So as said before, I'm professor here at the CVSSP at University of Surrey. And
excuse me, just your slides are not on the presentation mode.
Sorry. Yeah. There we go. Thanks.
Yeah, that's perfect. Thank you.
Yeah, so professor here at University of Surrey of AI and machine learning. And I will present this work called IMAGENDO. So this is a project that I developed while I was at University of Adelaide in Australia, and this is a still ongoing project. So these are my collaborators, and particularly Dr. Louise Hall. So she's the lead of this project from Australia. Okay, so let me start with some background on the project. So the project is about the diagnosis, automated diagnosis of endometriosis. So endometriosis, I will present this as a general context of the project. I know a lot of people here in this audience is aware of this, but usually this is presented to computer scientists who would know nothing about this. So just bear with me just a little bit. So this is definition of endometriosis is this growth of endometrial glands and stroma outside the uterus. Symptoms typically vary from painful periods, chronic pelvic pain, painful bowel movements, infertility, bloating, nausea, depression, and anxiety. And typically, this affects around 10% of women and girls globally. So there is no cure for endometriosis at this point that is known. However, there is treatment that it can be very effective, but to be treated, the woman needs to be first diagnosed. And there are three approaches nowadays for the diagnosis. One is surgery, so laparoscopy. So that's until 1 or 2 years ago, that was the golden rule for diagnosis of endometriosis. And then there are the more imaging approaches, the transvaginal ultrasound and the MRI. And in this work, our goal was to, have a patient being diagnosed through imaging instead of surgery, and that has a lot of incentives. For example, patient doesn't need to go through a surgery to be diagnosed. The whole process is going to be a lot quicker and a lot less expensive. So typically, when a patient goes through an imaging type of diagnosis for endometriosis, so patient will go to either MRI or ultrasound. So very rarely the patient will go to both imaging analysis. However, there are advantages and disadvantages with these two different types of images. So for MRI, for example, what you have is two different modalities that people usually use, Tier 1 and Tier 2. Advantages is that it's operator independent, so that's a big advantage for MRI, and it can be diagnosed remotely. Disadvantage, low accuracy, and we can also add here the high cost and the low availability of MRI machines. For TVUS, usually the protocol is very well defined. Basically, the sonographers are looking for soft markers, but it's really complicated to find them. So this is one of the big advantages. It's really operator dependent. But in terms of the advantages, it's cheap, it's more available, and when it's done correctly, it can be highly accurate, around 75 to 95% accuracy. And and one disadvantage of MRI is that it can have low accuracy because it doesn't show very well the lesions, the endometriosis lesions. So there are many different signs that people are looking for to diagnose endometriosis, and one of them is a pouch of Douglas obliteration. There are other signs that we don't deal with right now. This is in the future for this project. So right now we just deal with the pouch of Douglas obliteration. And the way the POD obliteration is detected, it differs a lot between MRI and ultrasound. So for MRI, we're basically looking for plaques and adhesions between ligaments and so on and so forth. So these are basically kind of small lesions in the MRI. So very hard to find and very difficult to analyze if you're not if you don't have experience with this particular imaging. So for the ultrasound, the exam usually is based on this thing called to find this sliding sign. I will show in a second what it looks like. But basically, you're looking for adhesions between the uterus and other structure in the pelvic area. So on the left, what you see is an MRI of a normal patient. So the patient here has no POD obliteration, and the ultrasound shows a positive sliding sign, which means that there's no adhesion or anything that can indicate endometriosis. On the right-hand side, what you see is an ultrasound exam that shows a lot of adhesion and a lot of, a very clear negative sign for the sliding sign. And the MRI also shows the POD obliteration in these areas here. And it's, again, it's really challenging to detect them if you're not very used to these images. Let me move here. So we started the project with this automated detection of POD obliteration from ultrasound. So basically, we work together with the doctors, collect around 800 sequences, and then I will show the split between positives and negatives. And then we build a system to just classify them into positive or negative. So the manual detection of POD obliteration ranges around 75 to 95%, and experts are not widely available. So that was a big incentive to develop the system. Not only is it hard to do the exam, but it's also very hard to diagnose once you have the exam in front of you. And then we have a system that tries to reduce the inter-observer variability and use the system where there's no expert availability, which is a big deal, particularly in Australia. If you go to rural areas in Australia, there is not a lot of clinicians available, let alone clinicians that would know how to diagnose endometriosis. So this is the system. I'm not going to go into a lot of details, but it's a typical convolutional network that would take a sequence, of frames of ultrasound and then classify that into positive or negative sliding sign. Our data set is divided like this. We have 646 positives and 103 negatives, and then we divided that into a training, validation, and test set. Typical around these numbers here, about 90% positive and 10%, 15% negatives. And our classification was at the same level as an expert, so around 95% accurate, 65% true negatives, negative sliding sign, right, which means endometriosis, and 98% positive sliding sign, and accuracy around 97%. So that was really an exciting result that promoted this project a lot in Australia, and then we got a very large grant, an MRFF grant, to develop this further. But then that prompted us to ask this question, right? So we have this TVUS with 95% accuracy, which is really high and very promising. But then we built a system to classify MRIs, and then our accuracy was just 65%, very low, not very promising. And then the question that we asked at the time was, how can we improve these MRI results? And the problem with the MRI results was not too much that, the system was not performing well. I mean, this is the accuracy that you would typically see in practice, in clinical practice by humans. So it's more like, okay, how can we improve these results to go beyond what clinicians can do? And then what we decided to do is to try to use some result from the ultrasound that we have, which produces 95% accuracy, and try to use that result to somehow boost the result of MRI. So we use this multimodal approach between the two modalities such that we can improve the MRI results and at the same time keep the ultrasound results. So the process that we used for this is called knowledge distillation. Okay, so the system that we developed for this knowledge distillation is the following. So what you see here as B, this TVU as pre-training, so that's the system that I just presented that can classify ultrasounds into positive and negative. And then what we did is first we do a pre-training. This is called a self-supervised pre-training of the MRI. So a self-supervised is something that would prepare the model to work better because we have such a small training set. So we try to use a very large training set that can self-supervise the model. The self-supervision here is basically tries to reconstruct the input data from MRI. So you see here that you have an MRI full of blank blocks. And what we try to do is try to reconstruct this blank blocks into the actual MRI block. And that's the pre-training part. So we have a very large training set that would basically reconstruct these MRIs. And once that's done, what we have is an MRI that a model that we take from this MRI encoder, and then we try to pair MRIs and ultrasounds based on their diagnosis. So positive endometriosis with positive endometriosis, negative with a negative. We don't have the same patient, but we have the diagnosis to pair them. And then we try to learn what the ultrasound model produces and use what the ultrasound produces to teach the MRI and produce like a feature, like it's similar to radiomics feature that you extract from this MRI to then classify the volume into positive or negative. So that means that we are kind of distilling the knowledge from ultrasound to improve the result for the MRI. So in our for this project, what we have is that for the pre-training part, we have this large training set with around 9,000 scans, T2 scans of pelvic MRI, female pelvic MRI. And then the ultrasound data is the same as before, around 750 ultrasounds. And for the endometriosis, we have around 90 volumes. So it's kind of a very small training set. And so the results, they were quite exciting here. So what we have is results for the ultrasound. That's what we had before, around 97 accuracy. So the first line here, what you see is the original MRI training without anything, and that's the 65% accuracy that we have. Then the third row, what you see is when we add the pre-training, then the result jumps quite a lot. It goes from 65% to 87% AUC, sorry, not accuracy, AUC. And then jumping to the next two rows, going to the last row, what we have is the pre-training plus the knowledge distillation and plus some fine-tuning that we added at the end. And then we get to around 90 to 91% AUC, which was, a very high result. It comes from 65% to 91%. And that's pretty close to the performance that we have in ultrasound. And the interesting thing here is that the patient now can come to a clinic, have an MRI or an ultrasound, and the patient will have a similar result in the end, right? So it will not have this very different result depending on the modality that is available for the patient. Yeah, so to conclude, this algorithm was able to distill the knowledge from ultrasound to MRI and reduce the distance in terms of accuracy. So not this paper, but the whole project got this Eureka Prize this year in Australia. And this particular paper got the best paper presentation at ISB, which is one of the major conferences in medical imaging. Yep, so yeah, thanks.
Thank you very much, Gustavo, for sharing with us this wonderful example. I would say almost in the field of endocrinology, or close to the field of endocrinology anyway. So we are late, but I think it's very important that we discuss this presentation, because that's a major topic and tool for the research roadmap. So if you agree, we can stay 10 minutes longer for a general discussion. So who would like to ask questions? Otherwise, of course, we already collected some questions. So Martin Fasnach, maybe you can start. We don't hear you. You're mute. And Martin just disappeared somehow. So
gone.
before I came back, maybe Maria Cristina Zenau, you'd like to ask a question?
No, I wanted just to say that Martin is gone. He put it on the chat. He put a message.
Oh, okay.
That was a
Okay. Just
bye-bye.
a bye-bye. He just said bye-bye. Okay, I
raising
thought he was raising his hand.
Yeah. No, I have not a specific question. I may have a comment. I think actually a comment for both, because we have seen from Gustavo an example on use of AI-based technology or predictions, and for better diagnosis. And then we have seen from Pinlin how, I mean, all the difficulties to put this into the clinical routine, let's say. And I guess that's really a step, a really difficult step. I think it's something, I mean, since I'm working a little bit on that, it's something which is really a major hurdle. So I just wanted maybe to ask, is there any such type of AI-based, let me say, device? Because if there is an algorithm or, as you say, a software, then it is entering into the device section. Are there already such type of devices which are currently used with all the authorizations and legislations, etc.? So that's a general question to both, to all the people who have presented.
I can go first if you don't mind, Gustavo. Well, at least from some work which I undertook. So besides being an academic, I also do some other things which relate to compliance and conformity, and sort of advising companies on compliance with technology regulations and things like that. And so in the summer, that we are basically what we saw, the device, I'm using the word device because it's basically using algorithm, and it's a software. It's essentially a software, right? And they were like, no, we shouldn't be a medical device, we're only a software. And what I was trying to tell them was that software is indeed considered a medical device under the medical devices regulation. So what they thought was just a software, and what was it, I can't tell you the company because I signed an NDA. But I can tell you that it's one of those fertility and devices, let's put it that way, very similar to the Chloe OQ device, right? And so basically they use the AI machine learning algorithms to make predictions on embryo feasibility, the health and quality of the eggs, for instance, and things like that. So these devices, I know for sure, are already in development or already being placed on the market. And one of the worries that they all have is, how much is it going to cost me to make new compliance, to undertake compliance assessments? Because then not only are we complying with medical devices regulation, we are also complying with the EU AI Act. And that's something which apparently is not very clear. So in my interpretation, I would say well, whatever is overlapping, we'll just do it once, right? Whatever might be additional, for instance, under the new legislation, then we have to do that. So that's as far as that kind of a device is concerned, we are already seeing it, and we're already also seeing, for instance, my colleague, I've got a friend who is a thoracic surgeon in Singapore, and they are using robotics on thoracic surgeries, and we spoke at length about how long it took to get the approvals to put that in place, with the entire compliance, with the legal team that was involved to ensure every single thing was basically every I's were dotted and things like that. So there are already systems out there in the market. So the question now is, when this act comes into effect, how is that going to change how companies then carry out their conformity, how companies carry out with their obligations under the act?
Okay.
And so during your talk, and maybe also Julia, I've heard about that this legislation might be in place at the end of the year. Is that realistic, or decided at least before the end of the year? Because then my understanding is that anything at the EU level that is not decided this year will be postponed because next year is an election year.
That's a danger. I was recently in the parliament. We were discussing generally what will happen with health and healthcare and money for health research. So that's a very, to be honest with you, I don't know what's happening now, but maybe Pinli now knows more about what's happening. But
I mean, I don't, to be honest. I mean, all that I know is that, they were hoping that before the AI summit in London, that, they were like very sure, no, all's going to be good, all's going to be good. And then on November 10th, something else happened. And so they're hoping that it would be done, I think by, hopefully, I think I read 25th, 26th November, there's going to be another meeting, and there is hope that they would be able to finally iron this out. But I don't see it more as an issue of, I don't think it's right down to talking about the specific nature of the contents anymore. It's come down to the political sort of will and how the different countries are actually seeing whether the regulations will actually cause innovation to be stifled or not. So that's where I think it's at right now.
Okay. And about the European Data Health Hub, what's the agenda for that in terms of development?
European health data.
Yeah.
Health data space.
Data space, yeah.
Oh, yeah, that everybody kind of looking forward to it. But again, they were talking about next year, about again regulation which will allow it to come, but exact date hasn't been set in stone. Again, we have to remember that not only election, it means also a new European Commission, which might have different agendas. So we going back to politics and
okay.
Yeah.
Well, the roadmap that we are going to write aims to cover, let's say, 10 years of research. So we have a little bit of space in front of us, but not that much. Yeah. Dirk, I think you'd like to ask a question. You're mute.
Yes,
yeah.
Indeed. I muted just now. I wanted to catch up on what you just said, Joe. We are essentially trying to develop a roadmap with a perspective of where do we want to be 10 to 15 years from now. So, probably we couldn't imagine what we have now 10 or 15 years ago in terms of technology process. But I see that, and I captured that from Pinlean's perspective. Everything starts with data. So first of all, you need to have big data sets, right? There's legislation that needs to be in place. But on the other hand, there is the perspective that this helps detection, precision medicine, that it is a solution to some workforce issues, as I understood from Gustavo as well. where would you guess that we should be in 10, 15 years from now? What mindset should we have within the EndoCompass project? Everything is possible? Very limited things possible? Where do you feel you would go? I see Pinlin already unmute, so you want to say something.
No, it's because I'm working on an existing project on how we can take health and medicine virtually into virtual worlds. So my sorry, my proposition is how we can build metaverse spaces for certain fields of medicine and certain fields of healthcare. And I think, obviously because I'm doing the work, I think but it may not actually be the case. People think the metaverse is dead, but I think that there is a huge potential for development in that particular area. And I still see that there are still priorities that are given in terms of developing virtual worlds, developing virtual reality and augmented reality solutions for certain types of medical and healthcare delivery. Obviously, the fields will be very limited, but one of the areas is already in terms of thinking about mental health, for instance, and dealing for people with certain conditions that do not enable them to leave the home, and also, but to still feel immersive enough that they can receive this type of healthcare. It's sort of an extension of telehealth, but in a more immersive way. And so we've got people working on this already, and I'm very excited to see where it goes. So that's why I was smiling. That's all.
Other question? Maybe I can, yeah.
Can I ask a question? Because when come to, in fact, any innovation in healthcare sector, and particularly bringing it to the clinics, I think, well, that's my comment, my understanding that one of real problem is trust of clinicians in this medicine, basically, and also training to use this wonderful artificial intelligence, all devices or program software. But maybe any comments on that, because I can see it as probably one of the major problem in not only just legislation, but clinicians or clinical researchers themselves.
I think that training both of physician and researcher is key, and it's not that well developed so far. And you also mentioned during the talks patients, explanation, somewhat training, which is even more challenging because the level of education is highly variable from one patient to another. Also, probably explanation and somewhat training of patient will be also very important for them on both for research, but also, of course, for clinical care. So indeed, there is probably in terms of education for the physician when they are in medical school, a huge need for training. I can't speak for every country, but in my country, there are some specific courses, but you need to apply on a voluntary basis for it. It's not a general training for all the medical students, and clearly that will be very important.
If I can share, one of the things that we propose in our work is recognizing the difficulties of bridging the gap between theory and clinical practice. And one of the things that we came up with a group of people at my center is basically about how we create ecosystem models and having different stakeholders being representative as part of this particular ecosystem. I mean, obviously down to the particular activities that we carry out between the different stakeholders will need to be thought out even clearer. But the idea is, and I think one of the first things we addressed was education and awareness training. And currently we are working with, at least for me, we are working with our medical school to try to embed some of the legal and ethical parts of complexities, really, of bringing in these kinds of technologies into the clinical practice, It's not easy, and we are still designing, for instance, having conversations with medical school, and even with hospitals. I did a training for a hospital with a small group of clinicians to just talk about, AI and all that, and they were like, oh, and realizing that there is actually a lot for clinicians to learn as well. Not just so it not become, not only is it a question of practicing your specialty area, it becomes now the fact that you have to use these particular tools because they become part of the technological environment, and then the training becomes very important, the awareness becomes very important. So I think it's always going to be a work in progress.
Maria Cristina, you raise your hand?
Sorry, I
Yeah.
have one point about this, because I think this point is actually becoming very clear from the AI perspective. So more and more we see the end users. It's like, what is an end user? So that's a great question. Is it clinicians? Is it patients? But we see that it's very important to involve them from the beginning. From the optimization of the model, they have to be there, right? So the system cannot be developed, and then we hope that the clinicians will use them. That shouldn't work like this. So what we're trying to do now is to involve clinicians and patients from the beginning, and actually optimize everything with them, not hoping that they will use at the end. So that's one thing that is happening in AI now. It's a collaborative type of development.
That's right. Maria Cristina.
Yeah, I completely agree on the things that have been said. I think this type of developments may really help to reduce, let's say, for instance, health inequalities over the territory. But to do that, but it may also increase. It depends how it is done. I'm not speaking about all the other inequalities, but at least access to health, etc. And I think you said the magic word, which is trust, and involving and also involving all stakeholders. But I guess the stakeholders should also include, so there should be all health workers, not just the doctors, and they should also be everywhere, in the sense, in specialized centers, academic institutions, but also GPs in the territory, because I think we need to increase the understanding also of the technology, of what it brings, and that is the only way of education. That's the only way of increasing trust, but it should be very large education. So that was just my little comment.
If I can just ask a very broad question. We've heard an example of endometriosis, which is quite a frequent disease. As you understand, in endocrinology, there are a broad variety of disorders that we group in 9 different working groups. Some disorders are frequent, like diabetes, and indeed, Pinlin, you were referring to example in the management of type 1 diabetes. But many of our disorders are rare disorders. So the amount of patients or the amount of data that you could access, even if we reach the European level, will still be quite limited. So are these disorders accessible to AI in terms of understanding and, of course, later on management of these patients, or we will never reach enough data to use this tool for these rare disorders?
I was thinking Gustavo actually has the solution to this.
This is the $1 million question. I don't know. It's there are things we can do in terms of being able to detect rare diseases. There are techniques, for example, in AI called anomaly detection, which basically you try to understand what's normal, and then everything else is abnormal. And then it builds what is called a one-class classifier. But then, if there are different types of abnormalities, then you're in trouble, because you can only say, well, this is abnormal, but I don't know what abnormality that is. And then you will need some sort of classification for that specific abnormality. And then it will need a few, well, not a few, more than a few training points to be able to classify it. So it really depends on the problem. Yeah, so this is a big issue. I don't have a good answer.
Actually, I
Okay.
have a question, Gustavo, as to what you think about because when we talk about the limited availability of data, one of the things I always ask is, what about synthetic data and how reliable might it be?
So synthetic data in the sense that you build with DALE or things like that.
Yeah.
I mean, this is a question that I've been asking for a while. I mean, I don't know, since 5-6 years ago, I've been trying to train systems with synthetic data. It doesn't work that well, because usually the synthetic data it emulates really well what you have in your training set, and then it doesn't help, because you use the training set to generate data, and then the data generated is similar to what you have in your training set. So in the end, it gets into this cycle that doesn't help you. So I think that to be able to break the cycle, you will need to somehow understand the features that generate the data better. So it's called disentanglement of your features, and then you play with this feature somehow. So for example, like you take shape of a lesion, and then you make it bigger or smaller, or the border of the lesion, you make it jagged or smooth, and so on, right? So then you can play with that, and then you can generate other things. Maybe in that way you can start helping. But the evidence is not great so far. I mean, in terms of synthetic data, it's good for pre-training, it's good for a lot of things, but not necessarily for classification.
Maybe Sandan, you'd like to ask the last question?
Thank you. Yeah, it's just a follow-up question to the one Pinlin asked. I've seen from your presentation that the pre-training you do for the MRI data is actually like filling the gaps based on the basically normal MRIs, right?
Mm-hmm.
So that is not considered the synthetic data, even though like the model is creating like a representation of this data, how this MRI should look like, or
no, this is a self-supervised training. It's not synthetic. We're not generating anything. So we're trying to fill in the blocks, right? So try to come up with a good way to input the data that is missing. That's all. And then from practice, we know that once we learn how to do it, there's a better understanding of the model, of the data.
okay.
And then it's kind of an initialization of the model for your training that it typically has very small training set. So yeah, there's no synthetic there.
So that's one, let's say one technology or thing that can be done for small data sets that can be used to actually make them usable for applications where there is not much data to get.
I mean, it's the same idea of foundation models. What we did there is basically the same idea as foundation models. But we didn't have a foundation model for that particular case, so we built one.
Okay. Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah.
That's why we need more money to do research in those areas and then generate new data from those areas, perhaps.
That's the aim of the EndoCompass project at the end of the day. So I think we had a lot of discussion, but we are really running over the time, so we are going to close. I think that the important thing for us is there is the science associated to our endocrine question that we need to work on, but there is also the legislative dimension that need to be a little bit pushed forward. That's my understanding hearing you today. So somehow it shows we should also incorporate that in our research roadmap for specific questions dedicated to endocrine health. So thank you very much. It has been recorded, so I think it will be very useful for all the members of the working group for the EndoCompass project. And I thank you for your time this afternoon.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank
Thank
you.
you. Bye.
Bye-bye.
Thanks.
All right.
Thank you. Bye.